Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Following the Once a Day conference, dairy specialist James Dunne reviews the key learnings and speculates the gains and losses resulting from tactical use of once a day. And I first asked James how farmers have implemented once a day milking in early lactation.
Yeah, so look at Emma-Louise, it's not something that's new. We've seen a large number of farmers, I suppose, that have been milking once a day in either spring or autumn or possibly both for a number of years and doing so very successfully and achieving very good results. But it probably is fair to say there's a growing interest in the tactical use of milking once a day, specifically, I suppose, for that early period of lactation and maybe for the month of February. And that's really to coincide with that busy period at the start of calving. And when we actually look at the numbers of people that tuned in for the recent once a day conference, it's evident that there definitely is a growing interest in that tactical use of once a day, specifically for that early period of lactation.
And I guess, from the perspective of the early period, that is of huge interest to people over the coming weeks as they prepare for early lactation. We might not necessarily focus so much on the autumn, but, autumn once a day is often linked with, a reduced milk yield and sometimes fatigue, as you get towards the 300 days of milking on dairy farms. If we think about the benefits, from once a day farmers that you have spoken to, or farmers who have tactically used once a day in the spring and or autumn, what are the benefits that they would cite to you?
The main benefit really is centered around labour, and possibly if some farms are finding it difficult to source labour, let it be on a part-time or full-time basis for that busy spring period, it's really to overcome issues with workload around that calving period. And I suppose research in the area shows that milking time is reduced by 30% for that period where once a day milking takes place. I suppose look at some of the other benefits. There is other health benefits in terms of improved energy balance, I suppose, due to lower body weight and body condition score loss as well. And depending, I suppose, on the length of walks at farm level, it can often have a positive impact on lameness levels within the herd as well.
And you mentioned the Once a Day conference, and we would have heard from Dr Emer Kennedy, who reported on the once a day milking trial that is underway at Teagasc Moor Park and has been in existence for 3 years at this stage. Could you give us some insight into the main findings that Emer would have reported on the day?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's the milking frequency trial within Moor Park has been running for a 3-year period now. Specifically looking at, I suppose, twice a day milking and comparing full-time once a day, early lactation once a day, late lactation once a day, and also combining both early and late lactation once a day. But I suppose specifically I'm going to run through, Emma-Louise, as you say, is topical, the early lactation once a day results. So really within that part of the trial, early lactation once a day took place either for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or 8 weeks. And what have we seen in terms of the first 4 weeks of lactation? Once a day milking reduced milk yield by 22%. So your twice a day cows were yielding 22.1 litres versus your once a day cows at 17.4 litres daily. There was no effect on milk fat, milk protein or lactose levels. It's worth noting, and we'll probably come back to it a little bit later on, Emma-Louise, there was an increase in somatic cell count in the initial 4 weeks, but there was no difference in the somatic cell count across the full lactation. So there is a tendency in terms of when cows are milked once a day to have increased levels of somatic cell count, but that didn't follow through for the full lactation and the return down to the same level of SEC as their twice a day comrades. The once a day milk solids yield was 20% lower than that of their twice a day group, at 1.96 kilos of milk solids versus our once a day group at 1.57 kilos of milk solids daily. Again, it's worth noting that there was an immediate increase in production when the cows returned to twice a day. But I suppose that's specific to that period of time, Emma-Louise. And I said within that period of time, there's a 30% saving on milking time. But really, what does it mean across, when we look at it across 35 weeks of the lactation? So when we take a broader look at it in terms of full lactation, so after 35 weeks of lactation, our twice a day cows had delivered 415 kilos of milk solids. Our once a day 4 week group, so the cows that were milked for 4 weeks at the start of lactation on once a day, had delivered 405 kilos of milk solids. The cows that were milked once a day for 6 weeks, 398 kilos of milk solids. And the cows that were milked once a day for 8 weeks, 387 kilos of milk solids. So we know that our twice a day group and our once a day group that were milked for that 4 week period, they have a similar 35 week milk solids yield. The once a day 6 week and 8 week groups had lower milk solids yield when you compare that to the twice a day group and the once a day group that was milked for the initial 4 weeks. Specifically to the tune of, there was a 7% reduction in the 35 week milk solid yield for that group of cows that was milked for 8 week period once a day at the start of lactation.
So really, really interesting figures that you're talking about there, James. And as you say, it's actually the full lactation farmers are interested in. And if we look at the first 4 weeks in isolation, you're talking about a 20% reduction in solids, which sounds, really big, and it's something that farmers would worry about. But when you look across the full lactation, you're talking about once a day milking in the month of February is going to lead to a reduction in milk solids of 10 kilograms. And then I guess you're looking at the balance of offsetting that against a 30% reduction in milking time, which, farmers need to balance that. And at a time where there is a really substantial workload, farmers may be more than happy to forgo those 10 kilograms of milk solids.
It's probably worth noting there, Emma-Louise, too, in terms of if that 30% of time saved can be put to, we'll say, improving other aspects of, I suppose, spring management. There may not be that 10 kilos of that 10 kilos of milk solids reduction, as you speak about there, may actually be made up in other areas of herd management. The one point I would make, Emma-Louise, as well, it's worth noting that the effect could be even less at farm level, as not all the cows would be calved at the start of that once a day period. So some cows, for example, may only be on once a day for a number of days. Whereas I suppose the cows that calve very all on in the calving period may spend that 4 week period.
That's a great point, James. To pick up on something else that you mentioned, cows on once a day have a tendency to have a elevated SCC relative to twice a day cows. Why? What are the main reasons for that?
Yeah, and as I said, look, there is a tendency for that for SCC to creep up and to be higher in that once a day period versus when we milk cows twice a day. And look, there's a couple of reasons for that. As we mentioned, look, the cows are only being milked once a day. Really, it's only being cleaned out as such once in that 24-hour period, compared to their twice a day cows. I suppose that others been cleaned out twice over that period. And visually, the cows are only inspected in the parlour once, Emma-Louise. So therefore, look, it's more difficult to pick up mastitis at an early age. And I suppose this is where best practice, good hygiene, and really good stock person skills come into play.
And, on that, James, say Don Crowley would have also presented at the Once a Day conference, and he would have had many tips, which are probably relevant for all cows, so whether it's once a day or twice a day. But, what were his key principles for maintaining and reducing cell count?
Yeah, absolutely, Emma-Louise. And Dunne, I suppose, had a number of key tips, key practices, and I'll try and highlight some of them here. But I suppose the first one that stuck out at me, like firstly, 60% of all early lactation mastitis cases originate in the dry period. So I suppose as we record this in early January, there's still a period of time, Emma-Louise, maybe to correct that, reduce that level of infection that's going to take place over the next number of weeks prior to calving. And I think a starting point there is look back at last spring's cell check report. Is there an issue? And I suppose what actions can be taken? Maybe some of those actions, I know Dunne number one there he had in terms of body condition scoring, and I suppose once a day herds are more susceptible to over conditioning, which could lead to a greater level of metabolic disorders. Milk fevers is going to have a knock-on effect on somatic cell count, stress within the herd. And really in that situation, we need to be looking at our pre-calving minerals. Are we feeding the appropriate spec? Are we feeding the appropriate rate? And I suppose frequency comes in there as well in terms of dry cow minerals should be fed twice a day. Placed an awful lot of emphasis on cubicle management, really clean dry bed. Let that be bedded down with sawdust and lime or whatever the bedding of choice is there for the farmer, but it needs to be clean and dry. I suppose old mats could be a problem. Is there pooling happening in terms of where there's actual feces being collected? Are cows lying in that? So in terms of your dry cow and dry heifer cubicle management, that's a key one there in terms of not picking up infection during that dry period. One on the heifers, possibly are they sealed or not? I know Dunne advocated on the once a day conference that possibly if there's an issue there, an external sealer could be used, maybe pre-calving teat spray. Run the heifers through and actually teat spray prior to that in the lead up to calving to reduce that infection. And then when it comes to the actual calving process, the calving boxes, hygiene and stocking density have a massive role to play in terms of recent infection that's going to be picked up in that close-up period. Just rule of thumb, Emma-Louise, we're looking for 10 meters squared per cow there in terms of space. Ideally, cows would be fit to come out and feed. Let that be on a slatted area. I know that's not maybe that's not available to all farms, but we should be fit to accommodate up to 10% of the herd on straw. That may mean converting another particular shed for that busy 3 or 4 week period, that cows aren't crowded in their calving area, and it's something that farmers possibly should look at now in the lead up to calving. Just finally then maybe to look at the parlour and look at the parlour should be checked over, liners should be changed, ensure pulsation's right, that the air bleeds are correct on the clusters, that there isn't issues, I suppose, in terms of the parlour has been serviced regularly and there isn't going to be issues in terms of the milking process with cows milking out properly. One point that was made, and Emer actually made it in terms of practice within the Moor Park trial as well, pre-dipping and wiping dry, I suppose, has the potential to kill up to 95% of bacteria, Emma-Louise, on that teat skin. But it must be done hygienically. If it's not, it could lead to more issues than actually prevent. So it must be wiped dry. One point, and I know Dunne has been an advocate of this for not only once a day herds, but twice a day herds, I suppose, in terms of CMT testing or California milk testing fresh cows before they go to the tank. And really the idea behind this is that you identify problems early and reduce the spread. So in terms of picking up, is it one particular quarter that is high in a cow? Is it all 4 quarters? If it's one particular quarter, you've usually a problem in terms of infection. If she's slightly elevated in all 4 quarters, Emma-Louise, it could be stress related and maybe we're checking in 24, 48 hours time again. But it's just that if the cow doesn't pass CMT, they don't enter the fresh group, Emma-Louise, so you're reducing that spread. Two other points, I suppose, look, we're advocating that early milk recording, and Dunne's big on this, and the fact that if you don't complete that early milk recording, it's very hard to assess in terms of how your dry period management has impacted, I suppose, on that early lactation SCC. And one final point, especially for the once a day herds, ensure cows are milked out fully. You're only milking the cows once a day. I suppose there's increased risk of Staph aureus issues within once a day herds. So just make sure the cows are milked out fully, and watch out for those slow milkers.
There's a lot of information there, James. I'd say people will have to rewind back to listen to that piece again. But I think you've given us, a logical step through the next 2 to 3 weeks prior to the real heavy onset of calving, and then into early lactation. The really key tips that Dunne would have, and we're fortunate that he has so much knowledge, but that comes with a lot of heavy detail. One particular aspect for once a day farms that you mentioned is they tend to have a slightly higher body condition score. I would have heard Dunne talk about this before, and it's really interesting in terms of how that can impact on cows in early lactation in terms of cell count or mastitis. With something like milk fever, it impacts on the muscle, in a cow's body, and muscle contractions. And we must remember that cow's teats, at the teat end, there is a muscle there that opens for milking, and then after milking it closes again. And where cows are struggling with, whether they've had milk fever or they're suffering with an underlying subclinical milk fever, that teat end is potentially open and exposed to picking up dirt and infection. But, really interesting point, and one of many that you've made.
Just on that, Emma-Louise, sorry, Dunne mentioned it actually at the conference, I suppose, and you're spot on in terms of that open teat end canal after milking. Possibly something that farmers could look at is maybe investing in the barriers that close down over your cubicles, or just some method of keeping cows out of cubicles for that 30-minute period after milking. Now, if cows are going to grass, it's not an issue, but I suppose in that spring period, cows are going to be in and out and on off grazing. So it's just something to keep in mind, as you rightly point out, in terms of that teat canal being open after that milking period. It may be something that farmers may look at investing in terms of the barriers that close down that can keep cows out of the cubicles for that period just directly after milking.
And James, something now completely different to say straight once a day milking. I've heard in the autumn time some farmers implemented a 10 in 7 as a milking frequency. Can you give us an explanation for what this concept means?
Yeah, and I suppose, look, it's something fairly recent in terms of the interest in this frequency, I suppose, Emma-Louise, among Irish farmers. But in this situation, look, the cows are milked 10 times in 7 days, or 10 out of 14 milkings, whatever way you want to look at it. Just in terms of how that works, cows are milked twice a day, on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and once a day on a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday and Sunday. So I suppose some herds may look at this approach as part of the lactation, as you say, maybe from that kind of July period onwards, whereas others may consider it for full lactation. And I know, speaking to Michael O'Donovan, he's had a number of queries, I suppose, with regards to this frequency. In terms of its benefits over a 3 and 2 or 3 milkings in 2 days, which is also talked about, is the more sociable milking times. Really, if you're looking at a 3 and 2, you're looking at 16 hours milking interval, and it works into for let it be for the farmer operator or staff into really, I suppose, unsociable milking times. And with regard to 10 and 7 versus the 3 and 2, you have a consistent weekly rota as well, which from a staffing point of view is easier to work with. Just on that, speaking to both Emer Kennedy and Michael O'Donovan, there's intention to look at alternative frequencies, Emma-Louise, this year. So we shall hope to, I suppose, have some data to share by the end of 2022. And I know 10 and 7 is one of those frequencies that is going to be looked at. Just in terms of the milking times that's going to be looked at, it probably looked like a 7 a.m., 4 p.m. and 10 a.m. Milking times, Emma-Louise. So 7 a.m., 4 p.m. on the twice a day and 10 a.m. on the once a day.
It's really interesting to see how the results develop from that. And as you say, hopefully by this time next year, there will be some results from Moore Park on that. James, as part of the Once a Day conference, the final speaker was Galway Once a Day dairy farmer Eamon Kennedy. You would have spoke to him. Can you tell us about his experience of Once a Day?
Yeah, absolutely, Emma-Louise. And Eamon gave a very thorough presentation, which I suppose can be watched back. And I think you're going to release a special edition of Eamon's interview as well. But maybe to give a brief synopsis of it, I suppose Eamon was tasked with losing 22 hectares of land, a milking platform land around his parlour in 2018. At particularly short notice, I suppose he had 5 or 6 weeks notice in terms of what he was going to do. So as he said himself, it was either a decision to sell cows or look at the option of milking once a day and utilising the whole farm. I suppose the issues with utilising the whole farm on twice a day was there's actually 3 public roads to cross to get to some of the furthest part of the farm, and it wasn't going to be applicable, we'll say, in a twice a day system. Just within that, and I suppose the title of the presentation is a high margin achievable. So what we would have seen from Eamon's presentation is a very high level of cow performance, Emma-Louise, delivering 410 kilos of milk solids in a once a day system of in or around 600 kilos a meal. Eamon was growing just over 14 tonnes and utilising 11.9 tonnes. So good cow performance, high levels of grass utilised, and it was leading to a net profit per hectare whole farm of €1,850. I suppose, how did that differ? And maybe the listeners have an interest in terms of how that actually differed from when Eamon was twice a day. And Eamon's profit per cow was reduced by anywhere between 200 and 250 euros on a per cow basis. But his profit per hectare remained relatively stable, given the fact that he had 22 hectares less land. So it went from 76 hectares to 54 hectares and maintained his cow numbers. So Eamon's milking 140 cows on 54 hectares, Emma-Louise, and stocked at 2.6 livestock units per hectare. So doing a very, very good job and running a very profitable system. I suppose, just to conclude, as Eamon was asked, would he ever consider returning to twice a day? And he agreed that he probably could make additional profits by doing so, but from a lifestyle point of view, it's not something I don't think he's going to consider anytime soon, Emma-Louise.
As you say, a really high level of profit and, lifestyle benefits, as well as the fragmentation issue that he has, that many once a day farmers, have adapted their system to work with. As you say, Eamon's interview will be available as a bonus episode on the Dairy Edge this Friday, so people can listen back to his full interview there. Huge amount of information here, James. As I say, some people may need to listen back for a second time, but it's really interesting as people enter the lactation of 2022 to consider the options, particularly now in early lactation. Once a day milking has the opportunity in the month of February to reduce labour input by 30%. Thank you, James.
Thanks a million, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to James Dunne for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.